My father, Daniel Calloway, stood on my porch on a Tuesday evening in October, 61 years old, and shaking hard enough that the umbrella in his hand rattled against the railing, and it took me 3 full seconds to place him. Because the man who disowned me at his country club 16 years ago, the man who told 200 guests I was no longer his daughter, did not tremble. I'm Margo Reyes now. I was Margaret Calloway then, 18 years old, standing in a ballroom in a yellow dress my grandmother had picked out, and within 4 minutes my father had stripped me of my name, my room, and my future for the crime of marrying a mechanic named Theo Reyes. Now I was 34, flour still on my hands from the bread I'd been kneading, looking at the same man, soaked through from a storm he hadn't planned for, asking in a voice I'd never once heard him use whether he could come inside. What I didn't know yet, standing in that doorway, was that this wasn't an apology. It was the first crack in a lie that had been sitting under both our lives for 16 years, and before the night was over, I would understand exactly what that lie had cost me. I want to tell you this story the way I actually lived it, which means I can't tell it to you in order. Some nights you don't understand what something meant until years later, when a different piece falls into place and the whole shape of it rearranges itself in your memory. That's how this went. So bear with me if I move around in time. I promise it all connects, and some of it won't make sense until the very end, the way it didn't for me, until I was standing in my own kitchen at 34, with my father dripping rainwater onto my floor. If you've ever had one moment suddenly explain years of disrespect you'd spent your whole life quietly rationalizing, I think you'll understand why I needed to tell this one slowly, and why I'm grateful you're here to listen to it with me. He didn't come in right away. He stood there working his jaw, looking past me into the kitchen like he was cataloging it, the way he used to walk through rooms at his company assessing what they'd cost to furnish. I saw him register the blue speckled mixing bowl on the counter, chipped along one rim, flour dusted across the rim of it. That bowl had been my grandmother Helen's. It was one of two things I'd taken with me the night he threw me out, and he knew exactly what it was, because his mother had used it every Christmas of his childhood, and he'd watched me use it every Christmas of mine, right up until the year he decided I didn't belong in his house anymore. His eyes moved off it fast, like it stung him to look at, and that was the first thing that told me something underneath this visit didn't match the surface of it. Margaret, he said. He'd never once called me Margo, not even before everything. I need to talk to you. It's about your grandmother's estate. I want to back up because you need to understand who Daniel Calloway was before you'll understand what it meant to watch him stand on my porch like a man waiting to be sentenced. My father built Calloway Steel Fabricators out of a single rented warehouse in Ashbury, Ohio, when he was 26, and by the time I was a teenager, it employed 400 people and supplied structural steel to half the construction projects in 3 counties. He was, by every external measure, a man who had earned the right to be proud of himself, and he was, by every measure that mattered to me, a man who could not tolerate anything in his life that he hadn't personally engineered. He chose my piano teacher, he chose my summer camps. He read my report cards out loud at dinner like verdicts. When I was 15 and got caught passing notes with a boy named Caleb Brennan, whose father drove a delivery truck for a regional grocery chain, my father didn't ground me. He had our family attorney draft a letter to Caleb's parents implying, falsely, that Caleb had been harassing me, and Caleb transferred schools within a month. I didn't find out what he'd done until years later. At the time, I just thought Caleb had stopped liking me. There was a phrase my father used so often it became a kind of family scripture. Callaways don't bend. He said it about business deals, about lawsuits, about disagreements with the country club board, about me whenever I cried over anything he'd decided for me. Callaways don't bend, Margaret. It meant, you will absorb whatever I require of you, and you will not show me that it cost you anything. I spent my entire childhood learning to perform that. I got very good at it. I want you to remember that phrase, because it comes back, and not in the way my father would have wanted. My grandmother Helen, his mother, was the only person in that house who didn't operate that way. She lived with us the last 4 years of her life, after her husband died, and she was the one who taught me to bake out of that blue bowl, the one who let me cry in her room without telling me to compose myself, the one who used to look at my father with an expression I couldn't fully read as a child, but that I now understand was something close to grief. She died when I was 16. At her funeral, my father gave a eulogy about her business sense and her work ethic, and didn't mention, not once, that she used to sing while she cooked, or that she kept a coffee can full of recipe cards on her nightstand, or that she once told me, a few months before she died, sitting on the edge of my bed, "Your father confuses control with love, Margaret. Don't you make that mistake." I didn't understand what she meant for a long time. I understood it completely the night of my 18th birthday, which is the night you actually came here to hear about. So let's go there now. The party was at the Ashbury Hills Country Club, a date my father had circled on the calendar for over a year, because 18 in our family wasn't really about me turning 18. It was about the public unveiling of the trust my grandmother had supposedly left in his care for my benefit, the formal moment, at least as far as the 200 guests knew, where the Calloway family celebrated its golden daughter coming into her inheritance. There were string lights threaded through the ballroom's exposed beams. There was a three-tier cake with sugared violets on it that I never got to taste. There was an ice sculpture of my initials that melted, ironically, into a puddle on the linen by the time anyone noticed what had actually happened in that room. I'd been seeing Theo Reyes for 8 months by then, in secret, because I already knew, with the precise instinct of a kid raised by a man like my father, exactly what would happen if he found out. Theo worked at his uncle's garage on the east side of town, the unglamorous side, the side my father referred to, without apparent self-awareness, as the other Ashbury. Theo had calloused hands and a laugh that came easy, and a mother who'd raised 3 kids alone after his father left. And the first time he met me, he asked what I wanted to do with my life, instead of telling me what I should want. I had never had that conversation with anyone in my family. I fell for him the way you fall for the first person who asks you a real question. We'd planned to wait. We'd planned to wait until I was at least out of my father's house, maybe through a year of college, build something quiet and stable before we told anyone. But Theo's mother got sick that spring, badly enough that he was talking about putting off his own plans to help cover her care. And somewhere in the middle of watching him carry that weight without complaint, I understood I didn't want to wait anymore. I should tell you a little more about those 8 months, because I think they matter to understanding why I chose what I chose. Theo and I met at a tire shop 2 towns over, where I'd gone after a flat stranded me on the way home from a college visit my father had arranged without asking me. Theo was the one who came out to the bay, wiped his hands on a rag, and asked me, before he even looked at the tire, whether I was all right, whether the flat had scared me on the highway. Nobody in my entire life had led with that question before. We started talking slowly over the following weeks, mostly by phone, because I had no real way to explain to my father why I was suddenly spending time on the east side of town. He took me to a diner on our third real date and ordered the cheapest thing on the menu without a flicker of embarrassment, then told me, plainly, that he was saving every spare dollar to help his mother and to eventually buy into his uncle's garage, and did I mind that he couldn't take me somewhere fancier. I told him I didn't, and I meant it more than I think he believed at the time. I had grown up surrounded by fancy, and fancy had never once asked me how I was doing on a highway shoulder. By the time his mother's diagnosis came that spring, I already knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that I wanted to be the kind of partner who showed up for the hard parts instead of just the photographed ones. We got married at the county courthouse on a Wednesday in March. 11 people in the room, my best friend Priya as my witness, and I told myself I would find the right moment to tell my father. I did not realize at 18 that there was no version of that conversation that would have gone well. And I certainly did not realize that the moment I chose to deliver it would become the most replayed memory of my entire life. I told him at the party, halfway through dinner, because my Aunt Carol had cornered me near the dessert table and asked, with the particular cruelty of someone who already half knew whether it was true, I'd been running around with some grease monkey from the east side. I panicked. I walked to where my father stood near the head table, glass of scotch in hand, mid-conversation with the mayor, and I told him quietly that I needed him to know something before he heard it from someone else. I told him I was married. I told him his name was Theo Reyes. My father did not raise his voice. That's the part people don't expect when I tell this story. He set his glass down on the linen so precisely it didn't make a sound, and he asked the mayor and the small cluster of guests near him to give us a moment, and then he turned to me, and in a voice pitched X exactly loud enough to carry to the surrounding tables without technically being a shout, he said, "You have humiliated this family in front of every person who matters to it, and I will not have my name attached to whatever life you've decided to throw yourself away on." I want you to sit with that sentence for a second, because it's the sentence the rest of this story orbits around, and it took me 16 years to understand it wasn't really about Theo at all. He told the room loudly enough now that there was no pretending otherwise, that the trust his mother had left for me would not be distributed, that I had disqualified myself from this family's name and its resources the moment I married down out of spite, and that, as far as he was concerned, the daughter he had raised had died sometime that spring, and the woman standing in front of him was a stranger wearing her dress. He had two members of the club's staff walk me to the coat check. My mother, who had died of an aneurysm when I was 11, and who I think about constantly in moments like this, was not there to intervene, and I have never been more aware of her absence than I was standing in that coat check room, listening to 200 people decide, in real time, which version of the story they would repeat at brunch the following weekend. I remember the specific things you remember from a night like that. The ones that don't seem important until they're the only things you can recall clearly. The coat check attendant, a girl maybe 2 years older than me, kept apologizing for something that wasn't her fault, handing me my coat with both hands like it was something fragile. Through the propped door, I could hear the band start up again, a song my father had specifically requested for the toast that never happened, and I remember thinking, with a strange detached clarity, that the playlist hadn't been told what was happening, that somewhere a DJ was about to announce a toast to a daughter who, as far as the room was now concerned, no longer existed. Priya found me out by the valet stand 20 minutes later, having heard secondhand from another guest, and she didn't ask me a single question. She just put her car keys in my hand and told me to drive, because she knew I needed to be doing something with my body, or I was going to come apart right there on the gravel. I called Theo from the parking lot of a gas station 4 miles away, and I remember him asking only one thing before he said anything else. "Are you safe? Are you somewhere safe right now?" I have thought about that question many times since, the contrast between it and the question my father had been asking me my entire life, which was never whether I was safe, but whether I was correct. That's the public version. That's the version everyone in Ashbury still tells if you bring it up, the version where Daniel Calloway disowned his only daughter over a marriage beneath her station. It is, as far as it goes, true, but it is not the whole story, and the rest of it didn't surface until years later, in pieces, the way truth tends to when someone has worked very hard to bury it. And that's when I started to understand that the version I'd been told my whole life about my grandmother's trust had never been the real one to begin with. That suspicion didn't arrive all at once. It built slowly, the way damp builds in a foundation long before you see the crack in the wall. The first year after the party, Theo and I lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on Birch Street, and I worked the counter at a dry cleaner's during the day and took night classes toward a bookkeeping certificate. because someone needed to bring in steady money while Theo built up enough capital to eventually buy into his uncle's garage. I want to be honest with you. It was hard in ways I had never once had to consider before that year. I had grown up in a house with a wine cellar and a housekeeper named Dolores, who I genuinely loved, and now I was learning at 19 how to make a chicken stretch across 4 dinners. But I also want to be honest about something else, which is that it was the first year of my life that felt entirely, unmistakably mine. Nobody was choosing my schedule, nobody was reading my mail. When Theo came home smelling like motor oil and exhaustion, we ate on the floor of that apartment with the TV as our only furniture, and I had never laughed that much in my entire childhood combined. My extended family split, more or less evenly, into 2 camps after the party. Aunt Carol, the same aunt who'd cornered me at dessert, sent me a single card that Christmas that said only, "I'm praying for you," which I understood to mean she'd chosen my father's side and wanted credit for the prayer anyway. My cousin Dana, on the other hand, started calling me every few months, careful, indirect calls where she'd update me on family news without ever quite saying she was defying him by doing it. It was Dana who told me, almost in passing, 2 years after the party, that my father had quietly sold off a parcel of land that had belonged to my grandmother's estate. Land my grandmother had specifically mentioned in conversations Dana remembered from childhood as being meant for Margaret's future. I didn't think much of it at the time. I assumed, the way you assume things about people who've already proven themselves capable of cruelty, that it was simply more of the same. A man liquidating whatever he wanted because nobody was positioned to stop him. It wasn't until I was 26, working as a part-time bookkeeper for a small estate law practice in the next county over, a job I'd taken because the hours worked around our daughter June's preschool schedule, that the first real thread came loose. I was filing closed probate records one slow Tuesday afternoon, nothing I was supposed to be paying particular attention to, when I came across a name I recognized instantly. Helen Calloway, my grandmother's full probate file, filed 9 years earlier in Ashbury County. Public record the way all probate filings eventually are. I told myself I shouldn't look. I looked anyway. What I found in that file did not match a single word my father had ever told me about my grandmother's estate. According to the filing, Helen Calloway's will had established a trust in 2003, when I was 11 years old, specifically for my benefit, to be administered by my father as trustee until I turned 25 or married, whichever came first, at which point the full principal, listed in the original filing at $340,000, was to be distributed to me outright. There was a clause, handwritten in the margin of a 2003 amendment and initialed by my grandmother's attorney, a man named Edwin Castor, who I vaguely remembered from her funeral, that read, "Trustee shall provide annual accounting to beneficiary upon her 18th birthday regardless of distribution status." My father had never once mentioned an annual accounting. He had told me when I was 18 and asked, shaking, through tears, whether there had ever really been a trust at all, that my grandmother's estate had been mostly sentimental items and a modest sum that had gone toward expenses already incurred on my behalf. I had believed him because believing him was easier than imagining my own father lying to my face about my grandmother's last wishes while standing 2 feet from her casket-adjacent eulogy about her work ethic. I made a copy of that filing. I told myself it was just curiosity. I didn't tell Theo for almost a month because I think some part of me needed to sit with it alone before I let it become real by saying it out loud to someone else. When I finally did show him, late one night after June and our son Eli were asleep, Theo read it twice, slowly, and then looked at me with an expression I'd come to know well over the years we'd been together. The look he got when something genuinely angered him on my behalf, which was rare because Theo wasn't a man who ran hot. "You don't have to do anything about this," he said, "but you should know it. Whatever you decide to do with knowing it, that's yours." I didn't do anything with it for a long time. I want to be honest about that too, because I think people expect revenge stories to move in a straight line toward confrontation, and mine didn't. I had two small kids and a business Theo and I were building together, a bakery counter inside his now fully owned garage that had started as me bringing in banana bread for the guys waiting on oil changes and had grown, slowly, into something with its own storefront 2 doors down. I had a life that required all of my attention, and going to war with my father over money I'd already learned to live without felt. For years, like it would cost more than it would ever give back. Those years were full in a way I genuinely hadn't expected after that night at the country club. We renovated the storefront ourselves on weekends, with help from Theo's cousins and a loan from a community bank that approved us based on 2 years of careful bookkeeping rather than anyone's last name. June learned to walk in that bakery, holding onto the edge of the display case. Eli's first word, according to Theo, who was the one in the room when it happened, was flour, which still makes me laugh more than it probably should. I'm telling you all this because I want you to understand that I wasn't sitting in that apartment for 16 years nursing a wound and waiting for my moment. I was living, fully and without much room left over for resentment, and the box in the closet sat there mostly forgotten for long stretches at a time, the way a smoke detector sits unnoticed on a ceiling until the one night you actually need it to go off. But I kept copies. That's the part that matters. Every time I came across another piece, in the years that followed, I made a copy, and I put it in a fireproof box in our hall closet, underneath winter coats nobody wore in Ohio summers. And I told myself I was doing it for no reason in particular. I understand now I was doing it because some part of me already knew this day was coming, the day my father would show up shaking on my porch. And some part of me had been quietly building the floor I'd need to stand on when he did. The second piece came 3 years later, when Edwin Castor, my grandmother's old attorney, retired and his firm did a records purge. And a young paralegal there, a woman named Stacy, who I'd worked alongside briefly on an unrelated estate case, mentioned to me over coffee that they'd found a box of old client correspondence that included several unanswered letters from a Margaret Calloway, dated when I was 19 and 20, requesting information about her grandmother's trust. I had never written those letters. I had never even known, at 19, to ask the questions in them. Someone had written them in my name and never sent them, or sent them and intercepted the replies. Or some version of that I still don't fully understand. Stacy gave me copies before the purge went through, 3 letters in total, typed on a word processor with a return address that was my father's house, not the apartment above the laundromat where I'd actually been living that year. And the signature on each one was close to mine, but not quite, the kind of close you'd get from someone who'd watched you sign things over the years and copied the shape of it without ever quite learning the rhythm of your hand. I sat in my car in that law office parking lot for almost 20 minutes after Stacy handed me the folder, just looking at my own forged name, thinking about how strange it was to feel violated by something written in your own handwriting that you'd never held a pen for. I added the letters to the box in the closet, underneath the winter coats, and I drove home and made dinner like it was an ordinary Thursday, because by then I had gotten very practiced at carrying things quietly. I want to pause here and tell you about a phrase that started circling in my head around this same period, because it became, in a strange way, the thing that finally pushed me from collecting evidence to actually understanding what I was building toward. My father used to say, whenever something in the business went sideways, that the only mistakes that mattered were the ones you got caught making. He said it like a joke at dinner parties, the kind of thing that gets a knowing laugh from other men who run companies the way he ran his. I had filed that phrase away for years as just another piece of his particular brand of humor. Sitting in that parking lot with 3 forged letters in my lap, I understood it wasn't a joke at all. It was closer to a philosophy, and I was looking at the evidence of exactly how far he was willing to take it. The third piece, the piece that finally turned a private suspicion into something I knew I might one day need, came 4 years ago, when I was 30, and a former employee of my father's company reached out to me out of nowhere through an old social media account I barely used. His name was Marcus Webb. He'd worked in Calloway Steel's accounting department for 11 years before being let go in what he described, carefully, as a disagreement about how certain assets were being categorized. He told me he didn't want anything from me. No money, no favor, nothing in return. He said he'd thought about reaching out for years and almost hadn't, worried it would look like he was settling a score of his own, but that he'd recently become a father himself, a little girl, and something about that had shifted what he was willing to carry quietly. He told me that in 2011, the year I turned 25, the exact year my grandmother's trust should have legally vested to me in full, Calloway Steel Fabricators had used an asset listed internally as Calloway Family Trust HC as collateral against a $600,000 operating loan to keep the company afloat through a slow construction season. He sent me a screenshot of an internal ledger entry, the account code circled in someone's handwriting, a notation beside it that simply read approved, DC. I cried for an hour after I read his message, not because I was shocked, but because some exhausted part of me had been hoping, all those years, that I was wrong, that there was still some version of this, where my father's cruelty had been about heartbreak and pride, and not, underneath all of it, about money he'd already spent before he ever invented a reason to need to. That's when I understood. The truth wasn't simply that my father had disowned me for marrying Theo. The truth was that he'd needed a reason to disown me before I turned 25, and the trust legally became mine, before my grandmother's annual accounting clause forced him to account for money he had already, by then, started quietly spending. Theo wasn't the cause, Theo was the convenient occasion. My father had needed an exit, a justification, a story he could tell 200 guests, and an entire town that made him the wronged party, instead of the man who'd been treating his dead mother's trust like a personal line of credit for 8 years. Callaways don't bend, he used to tell me. It turned out the only thing in that house that had ever truly bent was the truth, and he had been the one bending it, carefully, for a very long time. I put the screenshot in the box in the closet. I still didn't do anything. I told myself, the way I think a lot of people tell themselves, that some's lives are better spent building forward than turning back to settle old scores, and for a while I believed that completely. Our bakery, which we'd named Helen's after my grandmother, was doing well enough that we'd hired 2 part-time staff. June was 9 and obsessed with a stray cat we'd taken in. Eli was 6 and wanted to be, depending on the week, either an astronaut or a mechanic like his dad. I had built, brick by brick, exactly the kind of ordinary, ungoverned life my father had once promised me I'd ruin myself trying to find, and I had found it, and it was mine. And some nights I genuinely believed I'd let the rest of it go. Then came the Tuesday in October when he showed up at my door shaking. 16 years and 7 months after he told 200 people I was dead to him, and I understood, the second I saw his face, that he wasn't there because he'd finally found his way to an apology. I let him in. I want to explain why, because I think people will wonder. It wasn't forgiveness. It was curiosity, and maybe something colder underneath the curiosity. A sense that I had spent 16 years collecting puzzle pieces, and the man standing on my porch was, whether he understood it yet or not, about to hand me the last one. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Eli does his homework, and he wrapped both hands around the mug of tea I made him, out of habit more than hospitality. And he told me that Calloway Steel Fabricators had filed for bankruptcy 11 weeks earlier. A safety violation lawsuit from a worker injured on a job site 2 years back had ballooned, through appeals and a verdict that went badly for the company, into a judgment of nearly $2 million, more than the business could absorb. The bankruptcy trustee assigned to unwind the company's assets, he told me, His voice tightening on every other word, had begun auditing every account and trust the company's finances had ever touched, going back over a decade, and 3 weeks ago, a trustee's investigator had flagged an irregular asset transfer from 2011 involving something called the Helen Calloway Family Trust. "They're going to want to talk to you," he said, and his hands were shaking again around the mug, "about whether you ever received distributions. About whether you signed any waivers. I need you to understand, Margaret, that if this goes the way it could go, I could lose everything. Not the business. Everything. There are federal statutes about trustee misuse of a minor's trust assets that don't have the same protections bankruptcy gives a business debt. I could go to prison." I sat across from him in my own kitchen and I felt, for the first time in 16 years, something close to calm settle over the part of me that had spent a decade and a half bracing for this conversation in one form or another. "What do you need from me?" I asked him, specifically. He told me there was an affidavit his attorney had drafted, one that stated I had voluntarily declined my interest in the trust as an adult, of sound mind, sometime in my early 20s, in exchange for what the document vaguely described as informal familial support he claimed to have provided me during my transitional years. It was, in plain language, a document asking me to lie, in a sworn legal filing, to protect him from the consequences of a fraud he had committed against me starting before I was even old enough to know what a trust was. "There was no informal familial support," I said. "You changed the locks on the house the week after the party. Theo and I were living on his garage paycheck and whatever I made folding shirts at the dry cleaners. You know that. You had someone drive past our apartment that first winter, Dad. Dana told me, years ago. I always wondered why." He flinched at that, an actual physical flinch, the first one I'd seen from him all night, and for a moment I thought he might simply deny it the way he'd denied everything else for 16 years. Instead, he said quietly, looking down at the tea he hadn't touched, "I wanted to know you were safe. I didn't know how else to find that out without making it worse. You could have called," I said. "You had my number for the first 4 months. I know you did, because Theo's mother gave it to your secretary when she called asking after a missing toolbox that turned out to be in your garage the whole time. You never used it." He didn't have an answer for that. I let the silence sit there long enough that he started talking again, faster now, telling me he knew he'd been wrong about Theo, that watching me build all of this, gesturing vaguely at my kitchen, my home, the framed photo of June and Eli on the windowsill, had taught him something about what actually mattered, that he was asking me, as his daughter, for one act of grace after everything he'd put me through. "This isn't about Theo anymore, Dad," I said. "It hasn't been about Theo for a long time. I think it stopped being about Theo the day you decided you needed a reason to cut me out of Grandma's trust before I turned 25, and you'd have had to show me where the money actually went." His head came up at that, fast, and, for the first time all night, I watched something in his face shift from desperation into something closer to fear, real fear, the kind that comes from realizing the person across from you knows more than you'd planned for. "I want to tell you the line I said back to him next. Because it's the only thing I said in that entire conversation that I'd planned in advance, the only sentence I'd actually rehearsed somewhere in the back of my mind, across years of imagining a version of this exact moment. "You used to tell me Callaways don't bend," I said. "I spent my whole childhood thinking that meant we don't break under pressure. I understand now it meant you don't bend the truth unless it's bending in your favor. I'm not signing anything that isn't true, Dad. I haven't lied for you since I was 18 years old standing in that coat check room, and I'm not about to start again now that I'm the one with something to lose by it." He went very still. I think even then, some part of him had been hoping I wouldn't know enough to push back. That 16 years of silence had meant 16 years of ignorance, and watching that assumption collapse in real time across his face was its own kind of answer to a question I'd carried for a long time, the question of whether he'd ever actually understood what he'd done to me, or simply assumed I'd absorbed it the way I'd absorbed everything else. I got the fireproof box out of the hall closet. I set it on the table between us, between his mug of cooling tea and the photo of my kids, and I started laying it out, piece by piece, the way I imagine I'd always known, somewhere underneath my own denial, that I would eventually have to. The original 2003 trust filing, with Edwin Castor's handwritten margin note about annual accounting. The intercepted letters I never wrote and never sent. Marcus Webb's screenshot of the 2011 internal ledger entry listing the trust as loan collateral. A timeline, in my own handwriting, that I had apparently been keeping, a little at a time, for almost a decade without ever fully admitting to myself. That's what I was doing. I'm not going to lie for you, I told him, but I'm also not going to pretend I don't understand what's actually at stake here. For you and for the people this company employs, and for whatever's left of Grandma's trust that might still be recoverable. So here's what I will do. I'll talk to my own attorney tomorrow morning. I'll find out exactly what my legal options are as the actual beneficiary of a trust that was misused, and I will decide on my own terms, in my own time, what I think is fair. That's not a gift to you, Dad. That's just me finally being allowed to make a decision about my own inheritance instead of having it made for me. He left a little after 10 that night, in the same storm he'd arrived in, and I watched his car pull away from my window with the same strange, hollow calm I'd felt the whole conversation through, the calm of finally setting down something I hadn't realized I'd been carrying with both hands for 16 years. The weeks after that moved faster than I expected. The frantic calls started almost immediately, not from my father, who I think understood, finally. That calling wouldn't help him, but from the rest of the family. Aunt Carol called twice in 1 week, her tone shifting entirely from the cold disapproval of that single Christmas card to something close to pleading, reminding me that family stood by family, that surely I wouldn't want to be the reason my father went to prison at 61. When I didn't answer the second call, she left a voicemail that started apologetic and ended, almost without her seeming to notice the shift, accusing me of having always been the dramatic one, which told me everything I needed to know about how little had actually changed in her understanding of that night 16 years ago. My cousin Dana, who'd quietly kept in touch with me all those years, called too, but for a different reason. She wanted to tell me she was proud of me, and that she'd always suspected there was more to that night at the country club than my father had ever let on, and that she'd kept a few of her own memories of those years that she'd never known what to do with, things she now wanted to write down for me if I ever wanted them. Two relatives I hadn't spoken to since the party sent messages within days of each other, both using almost identical phrasing about wanting peace in the family and letting bygones be bygones, which told me more about how coordinated their concern was than either of them probably intended. I later learned from Dana that my father's sister had organized something close to a phone tree, calling around to gauge how angry I seemed and whether I might be talked down before any of it became public. Nobody from that side of the family asked me a single question about what had actually happened to my grandmother's money. Not one. They wanted the appearance of resolution, though they'd always wanted the appearance of a happy, intact family, far more than they wanted to know the truth underneath it, and I found that, more than almost anything else in those weeks, the most clarifying thing of all. My attorney, a sharp, unhurried woman named Renata Quinn, who specialized in trust litigation, reviewed everything in the box over the course of a week, and told me, in plain terms, that I had a strong claim not just to the original principal plus reasonable interest accrued over more than a decade, but potentially to damages for breach of fiduciary duty, given the documented pattern of concealment. She also told me something I hadn't fully considered, which was that my cooperation, or lack of it, with the bankruptcy trustee's investigation could materially affect whether my father faced civil consequences alone or whether the matter escalated to criminal referral, and that the decision of how hard to push was, entirely, and for the first time sometime in my life, mine to make. I thought about my grandmother Helen a lot during those weeks. I thought about her sitting at the edge of my bed, telling me my father confused control with love. I thought about the handwritten clause in the margin of her trust amendment, the one demanding an annual accounting she must have known. On some level, he might try to avoid. I don't think she anticipated exactly what would happen. I think she anticipated, with the clear eyes of someone who'd raised him, that he might need to be checked, and she built one small, stubborn safeguard into her estate planning that took 16 years and a bankruptcy filing to finally do its work. In the end, I didn't pursue the criminal route, though I want to be honest that for about a week I seriously considered it. What I pursued instead, with Renata's help, was full civil restitution. The recovered principal, recalculated with statutory interest, paid out of what remained of the company's liquidated assets ahead of unsecured creditors, since a misused trust held a legal priority most of Calloway Steel's other debts didn't. It came to just under $500,000. My father avoided criminal referral, but only because the trustee's investigator closed the file once restitution was confirmed and documented, not because anyone decided he hadn't done anything wrong. I didn't tell him I'd decided against pursuing criminal charges out of forgiveness, because it wasn't that. I told him, in the one phone call we had after Renata finalized everything, that I'd made the decision because I didn't want my children's grandfather in federal prison, and because some part of me still believed, perhaps too generously, that a man who'd spent his whole life mistaking control for love might, with everything finally stripped away from him, learn the difference before he ran out of time to use it. I also told him that this was the last conversation we'd be having for a while, possibly a long while, and that if he ever wanted a real relationship with me or with his grandchildren, it would have to be built slowly, on actual honesty, starting from absolute zero, and that I was under no obligation to make that easy for him. He didn't argue. I think, by then, there was nothing left in him to argue with. I used part of the restitution, once it cleared, to do something I'd thought about for years without ever quite believing it would become real. Theo and I set up a small scholarship through Helen's, the bakery, named for my grandmother, available to graduating seniors in Ashbury County who were planning to marry or had already married young, against family expectations, into a trade rather than a 4-year track. We funded the first 3 recipients ourselves that spring, and I sat in the audience at the county scholarship dinner watching a 19-year-old named Priscilla, who was marrying into her fiancé's landscaping business instead of going to the state school her parents had wanted, accept the first check with the kind of relief on her face I remembered from my own life at that age. The relief of someone learning for the first time that her choices were allowed to be respected instead of merely tolerated. I keep my grandmother's blue speckled mixing bowl on the counter at the shop now, where customers can see it, and when people ask about the chip in the rim, I tell them the truth, that it survived a lot longer than anyone expected it to, including me. I don't know exactly what happens with my father from here. He's reached out twice since that phone call, careful, brief messages, nothing demanding, which is itself new enough to notice. One was a card on June's birthday, no money inside, just a few sentences about hoping she had a good year. Signed only Daniel, not Grandpa, like he understood, on some level, that he hadn't earned the second word yet. I haven't decided yet what I owe that, if anything. I told Theo, the night the card arrived, that I felt strange holding it, not angry exactly, just unsure what shape this was supposed to take. A father who'd spent my whole childhood demanding I perform composure now, apparently trying, clumsily, to perform contrition. Theo just said, the way he tends to, that I didn't owe anyone a decision before I was ready to make it, that some doors get to stay halfway open for as long as I need them to. What I know is that I spent 18 years of my life believing that Bendings was the price of belonging in that family, and 16 years after he threw me out for refusing to keep bending, It turned out the only thing that ever actually needed to break was his version of the truth, not me. My kids have never once heard me raise my voice, the way I heard my father raise his that night. Not because I'm performing restraint the way I was trained to, but because I've genuinely never needed to. That difference, more than the money, more than the apology I may or may not ever get, is the inheritance I actually ended up keeping. If you've ever spent years quietly gathering proof of something you were terrified to say out loud, I hope this told you it's allowed to take as long as it takes, and that the people who taught you to doubt yourself are rarely the ones who get to decide when you're finally ready to stop. And if any part of tonight's story sat somewhere familiar in your own chest, I'd genuinely love to know which part it was.